Madam Chair, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as you know, is one of the great legislative achievements of American history. It is perhaps the greatest single statute of the 20th century in a century of great statutes, including the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. But the Voting Rights Act was born out of the blood, sweat, and tears of the American Civil Rights Movement. In the wake of Freedom Summer and the murders of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and other civil rights heroes, and after the famous March on Washington, where Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech, the Voting Rights Act transformed American politics by bringing into our elections millions of voters who had been disenfranchised for a century after the Civil War ended. It changed the nature of politics in the Deep South and across the United States, and it changed the politics of the United States Congress as well. Now, theoretically, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had solved the problem of disenfranchisement after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment established equal protection, and the 15th Amendment banned discrimination in voting. But after the dismantling of Reconstruction, African Americans were subjected to a regime of disenfranchisement that included violence, terror, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and an ever-expanding panoply of devices and tricks and tactics to keep black people from being able to register to vote and to participate in elections. The Civil Rights Movement and President Lyndon Johnson fought for the Voting Rights Act, which passed in 1965, and which included a package of strong remedies targeting discriminatory voting practices and devices in the areas where discrimination was most egregious and virulent. A key component of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5, the preclearance requirement, which compelled covered states, that is, the states to which it applied, to stop discriminating and to subject all changes in their voting practices to the Department of Justice or to the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. States were covered if they had used illegal voting discrimination devices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and character exams, and if fewer than 50% of the people were registered to vote or allowed to participate. Now, the Voting Rights Act was challenged immediately in litigation called South Carolina versus Katzenbach. But in 1966, the Supreme Court rejected arguments that the Voting Rights Act violated the Constitution. The Supreme Court said Congress may use any rational means to effectuate the constitutional prohibition on race discrimination in voting. It upheld the preclearance requirement against attack. Specifically, it was said by South Carolina that it violated the so-called equal footing doctrine, but the Supreme Court said that the equal footing doctrine applied to the admission of states and not to the Congress's power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment or Section 2 of the 15th Amendment. So all of this worked for the Voting Rights Act to usher in a new era of real democracy in America. The preclearance requirement meant that the states and counties and jurisdictions that had been discriminating had to submit to the Department of Justice or to federal court their plans for changes. And that worked to enfranchise millions of voters across America. It worked for the election of thousands of African-American elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. And the genius of Section 5 was that jurisdictions had to submit potentially discriminatory changes before the harm took place. Because anybody can go ahead and sue under Section 2 after an election is over, but then it's too late because the harm has already been done, the election has taken place. So even if you win in court, the court is not going to order a rerun of the election. It's not going to require all the voting to take place again, and so it's too late at that point. Section 5 puts the burden on the potentially discriminating parties to prove that they're not discriminating when they make changes in voting laws. And it worked all the way up until 2013, when the Supreme Court rendered its 5-4 decision in Shelby County versus Holder. And the Shelby County case struck down the Section 4B formula for which states were covered, declaring that this formula was now out of date because it went back many, many decades to the 60s and 70s, and that the Congress would need to update the formula to address current needs in the field and to show that the formula relates to the current problems that we are targeting. And the court said specifically that coverage was based on decades-old data and eradicated practices, like literacy tests, which don't exist anymore. When it got struck down, dozens of states and counties that were previously required to pre-clear changes related to voting didn't have to do it anymore, and they began very quickly, almost instantly, to roll back various kinds of voter protections and to pass strict voter identification laws, to pass massive voter purges, to implement cuts to early voting, to close polling places, and so on. I'm going to read to you from one of the witnesses who testified before the House Judiciary Committee, Kristen Clark, the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, who said, "We have vetted complaints from tens of thousands of voters since Shelby, many revealing systemic voting discrimination. In short, this is how Shelby has impacted our democracy. First, we've seen the resurgence of discriminatory voting practices, some motivated by intentional discrimination, and this discrimination has been most intense in the very jurisdictions that were once covered by Section 5. They range from the consolidation of polling sites to make it less convenient for minority voters to vote, to the curtailing of early voting hours, the purging of minority voters from the rolls under the pretext of list maintenance, strict photo ID requirements, abuse of signature match verification requirements, the threat of criminal prosecution, and more. Second, we've seen increased levels of recalcitrance and hostility among elected officials who institute and reinstitute discriminatory voting changes with impunity. Third, the loss of public notice regarding changes in voting practices that could have a discriminatory effect is significant. Fourth, the public no longer has the ability to participate in the process of reviewing practices before they take effect. Fifth, the pre-clearance process had an identifiable deterrent effect that is now lost. Sixth, the status quo is not sustainable. Civil rights organizations are stepping up to fill the void created by the Shelby decision at insurmountable expense. And finally, this will be the first redistricting cycle in decades in which redistricting takes place without the Voting Rights Act. So that's one example of testimony that we got from all over America about what the Shelby County versus Holder decision meant by dismantling Section 5, by knocking out Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. Now, H.R.4 is doing precisely what the Supreme Court invited us to do in the Shelby County decision, to pass a new coverage formula for the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance requirement based on new data and a new formula designed to address current contemporary problems. The Judiciary Committee and the House Administration Committee had a combined total of 17 hearings, 9 on the judiciary side with its subcommittee on the Constitution and Civil Rights and Liberties, and 8 in the House Administration Committee's subcommittee on voting rights. And they heard about restrictive and discriminatory practices taking place in numerous states across the country, including Texas and Georgia, where after the end of pre-clearance, Georgia voters faced a myriad of new voting barriers, including the closure of more than 200 precinct polling places, spoiled voter registration materials, purging of more than 1 million voters in a racially discriminatory way, restrictive voter ID laws, and systematic rejection of absentee ballots, and more. We also looked at North Carolina, which passed a so-called monster voter suppression law, which resulted in race discrimination in accessing the polls, including the closure of dozens of polling sites and long voting lines. The law eliminated same-day voter registration, reduced early voting by a week, and curtailed satellite polling sites for elderly and disabled voters, and so on. Madam Speaker, this legislation is the product of massive legislative inspection of voting conditions across the United States of America today, and it threads the needle that was offered to us by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision by amending the Voting Rights Act to revise the Section 4B criteria and providing other voter protections at the same time. Specifically, the bill creates a new coverage formula that applies to all states and hinges on a finding of repeated voting violations in the preceding 25 years. It establishes a process for reviewing voting changes in jurisdictions nationwide, focused on a limited set of measures, such as voter ID laws and the reduction of multilingual voting materials. It requires reasonable public notice for voting changes. It allows the Attorney General authority to request federal observers, and it increases accessibility and protection for Native American and Alaska Native voters. So, just turning now to H.R. 326. For more than 20 years, American presidents from both political parties and Israeli prime ministers have supported reaching a two-state solution that establishes a democratic Palestinian state to coexist peacefully and constructively side by side with a democratic Israel. Middle East peace talks have favored the two-state solution and opposed settlement expansions, moves towards unilateral annexation of territories, and efforts to arrive at Palestinian statehood outside the framework of negotiations with Israel. In 2002, President Bush stated, "My vision is two states living side by side in peace and security." In 2013, President Obama reiterated this exact same commitment, stating that negotiations will be necessary, but there's little secret about where they must lead: two states for two peoples. This resolution emphasizes the sentiment of the past 20 years of peace talks by expressing the sense of this House of Representatives that only a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can ensure Israel's survival as a secure democratic state and fulfill the legitimate aspirations for a secure and democratic Palestinian state. It further expresses the sense that any U.S. proposal that fails to endorse a two-state solution will put a peaceful end to the conflict only further out of reach.